I begin by saying greetings, as would say hola, bonjour. Yeah. This presentation is meant for the International Congress of Education Technologies and a meeting of researchers in distance education in Brazil on the 24th and the 28th of August, a few months later down the road. Before I begin this presentation, I would like to pay tribute and acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands, both here and in Brazil, on which we are operating today. The title of my presentation is called The Idea of Open Education, a critical review. I started thinking about open education alongside many other people a long time ago, obviously, because of my background, as you can see from this slide. But an opportunity came about 2016 and 2017, which is, 3-4 years ago now, when a group of authors, Divya Singh and Stuckelberger, were putting together a book called Ethics in Higher Education, Values-Driven Leaders for the Future, from South Africa. And they asked me to write a chapter. So I wrote a chapter in that book. And the reference of this you will have access to. Editors are Divya Singh and Stuckelberger. The title of the book is Ethics in Higher Education, Values-Driven Leaders for the Future, published in Geneva by Global Ethics, an organization which looks after or is interested in ethics in higher education. So the chapter that I wrote was called Open Educational Practice, caveat emptor, which basically meant if you are thinking about or entering into open educational practices, then you do that with caution, with care. There are some reservations, and I think that's what I'm going to talk about. Not that I think I'm going to talk about, that's what I'm going to talk about. But first of all, it's important to be clear about what the focus of my presentation today is going to be. When we talk about open education, the first thing that I want to make clear that open education is not a new concept, especially those of us who are working in universities like this one and open universities such as the United Kingdom Open University or the University of South Africa or the Indira Gandhi National Open University in India. And as many people might think, open education, the idea of open education did not start with MIT putting its courses or course materials online, which is what it did about 20 years ago. MIT put all of its syllabuses, syllabi, online. Now, people thought that was really opening up education. So let's say, for example, you're teaching a course on chemistry or physics, and every bit of the content in terms of articles, resources, MIT put it online so for anybody to use. So if you're teaching the same kind of course in India, let's say, for example, or in Africa, you have access to that content. So a lot of people have suggested that was the beginning of open education. Now I'm suggesting that that wasn't the beginning of open education. That open education for people like you and I, who work at universities like this, has a very rich pedigree that goes back a long way when we talked about independent study, distance education. And again, I have explored this idea in an editorial that I wrote in 2016 in volume 37 of the journal Distance Education, called The Case of Open Educational Practices. So I am going to talk about all these sorts of things in the next 30-40 minutes and engage in a critical analysis of those ideas. So let me then broaden a little bit and talk about what the scope of this is going to be. when we talk about open education, the context that we are talking about is open education that is of organized nature. Now, education happens all the time, everywhere. We learn at home, we learn on the road, we learn on the football field. We learn everywhere. We learn when we are having a talanor and those kinds of things in this part of the world, or conversations in other part of the world. So learning and teaching is not new. What we are talking about is learning and teaching that is organized, that is institutionalized, and opening that up to a larger audience. So I don't want to confuse the idea of open education with independent study or self-study, informal study, non-formal study. Those sorts of things are happening all the time. So when education began to be opened up, and only those that were of organized nature, we started calling it things like extension services. We called it extramural studies. We started off in these buildings at this university, or some places we called it off-campus studies. In other places it's continuing education, or correspondence education, and then later distance education. And more recently, we are calling it flexible learning, blended learning, distributed learning, even disaggregated learning, because it's not aggregated in a place, it's happening from different places. And of course, online learning that's catching up. So we are talking about those kinds of educational opportunities that are opening up. Now, the other point that I want to make is that the premise that open education is built upon. What is that premise? Why are we talking about open education? You know, a lot of people are talking about open education. So what's the premise? What's the fundamental idea? And it is this, and I want to spend a few minutes talking about that education is a public good. That, you know, it's a necessary thing, that we need to have it. You know, it's like the air we breathe. And there's a value proposition for that. So organizations are built on this premise, and it's a basic need, because without which leading economists and thinkers have said that without education, you can't really have freedom. That's a very serious thought. And I think it's worth thinking about. Amartya Sen, he's a Nobel Prize winning economist. He said that education is the path to real freedom. And he's written books like, poverty is not just absence of income. Poverty is the presence of powerlessness. You don't have power. You don't have a voice. You are excluded from the mainstream of society. That's being poor. Poor is not just simply not having money. And freedom, this idea of freedom. People talk about freedom. We talk about being able to vote is freedom. Well, not really, you know. So what he is saying is that you don't have education. You can't get out of the situation that you're in, because you can't participate in the processes of society. Voting is maybe one thing, but other things, being able to access resources of the society, you know, being able to go to a movie, being able to go and enjoy a concert, going to the cinema, all those sorts of things that we do when we engage in society. Educated people are always able to do this because they have the money to do it. Ill-educated, poorly educated, uneducated people can't access that. They're sitting in their villages, you know, sorry, I don't have the money. Even if they had the money, they don't have the opportunity to go, not participate. Now, education opens up those opportunities. And this is what Amartya Sen is saying. Unless you give people the education that they need, they will never be able to live or lift them up from the situations they're in. You can give them the money, but even money wouldn't be able to get what they really need. So this is why it is saying that if you want a productive, participatory society you need to educate your people. Now, you can go further. A lot of people have argued to say that you need to educate women, because the women are the people who really hold the families together. You educate the women, you educate a society, you educate a community. Now, I'm taking some time to explain this point or talk about this point because we don't normally think about it that way. So that if you believe in that, if you believe in that concept, this is why earlier on I talked about the connection between education and development, that education is an instrument of development. Usually when we talk about development, people talk about development in terms of economic development, political development, but we don't talk so much about educational development, because without education, there can be no real development, isn't it? You have to be able to learn to read and write, because without it, you can't participate. So that is the premise, that is the fundamental principle of opening up education. You cannot keep something like that wrapped under cover and accessible only to the privileged and those who can have access. You want to make education available as broadly and widely. Many of us in this room and my audience in Brazil would agree to say that many of us would not be sitting in these kinds of situations if we didn't have education. We might have had the money, but still, without education, you wouldn't be participating in these kinds of conversations, in these kinds of opportunities. So let me strip that a little bit more and talk about what do we really mean by open education. Now, people who would have been in the business of that organized nature of education will know that when we talk about open education, we talk about open access. So open access is basically making sure that you are not you're not excluded from educational opportunities because you are maybe old or you are disabled or handicapped in some way, not handicapped but disadvantaged in some way. So the idea of organizations such as USP and the Open University United Kingdom was to open up education to everyone, irrespective of your social situation, economic situations. Education is equally accessible to everybody. So that's the first part of opening up. You got to be able to say, look, if I want to come to this institution and I am in my 30s and working part-time, then you should be able to come. We have to make education available to these kinds of people in whichever way we can, which is why we have online education, which is why we have distance education. So they don't have to come to the university if they're working full-time or part-time and are 30 years old and looking after family. So that is opening up access. Then related to opening up access is this idea of open learning strategies, being able to study anywhere. Access is one thing, being admission is one thing, but being able to do it anywhere, anytime, any pace, any place is also required. So open access is one thing and open learning strategy is the other thing. So that what we are trying to do in places like the University of South Pacific and other universities that I mentioned is to employ strategies so that people can study. So online education, distance education, printed materials is very important, because no matter what you say, large parts of the developing world will never have reliable access to connectivity. So forget about online education for them. So print is not such a bad idea. If it is necessary, if you want to talk about open access and open learning, then you have to include print as part of that conversation. You cannot ignore that. Now, the third part is something that has come up more recently over the last 20 years. This is the idea of open scholarship. And this is a more contentious thing. The idea of open scholarship is being able to share your resources freely and openly with other people. And people talk about things like, for example, our engagement with social media, when we communicate with people on Facebook, Twitter, and all those kinds of things, when we put things on the web, when we write material, that what we should do is adopt a culture of sharing. That traditionally what education has done is, we produce things, we academic write things, and we keep it under wrap and cover, right? Reps and cover, because we think that, it's my intellectual property, you can't touch it, you can't use it. If you want to use it, then you have to pay money for it, right? But the movement around open scholarship is saying that if you spend public funds, let's say, on working on a book chapter. Let's say you wrote a book chapter while you were employed at a university. So the university paid you salary to do that on time. Now that should not be under wraps and cover. That should be publicly available, because the public money funded you to do that in the first place. You took a salary, all right? So you can have your name on it, that's your IP, you wrote it, that's fine. But you can't charge money for people to have access to, you shouldn't be able to charge money. So this is the idea of opening scholarship, opening up content, which is what MIT did. MIT in 2001, 20 years ago thereabouts, put all their content online, saying that here we are, because this was developed at a time when this content for this course was developed at a time when people were paid to work from public funds. So they developed this content, now it's out there for public good. So it goes back to the idea of education as the public good that I was talking about, right? Of course, MIT will be saying, look, I'm not giving my degree away, I'm just giving you content, which is not much different from going to the library, right? and looking at the books that are there. You ain't gonna get a degree by looking at the books in the library. So if you want a degree from MIT, then you pay money for that. Then you pay registration fees for that and that sort of thing. But all MIT is doing is putting content out there and saying, we are now sharing our scholarship with you openly and freely. This is a very interesting slide about equality and equity. I'll give you an example. You have a game. A game is being played. Let's say it's baseball or rugby, or soccer, or whatever, and you have 3 people trying to look into the field from outside the barriers. So the father is a tall guy. He's standing on a stool, and he can see the game over the barrier. And the older son is tall enough, so he can see the barrier as well. But the little fellow, who's about 5 years old, is standing on the same level of stool. They've got 3 stools. Think of this as beer carton. He can't see anything because he still can't reach the barrier. So what you're saying that, in that case you're saying, I'm giving you 3 cartons, guys. All of you've got equal opportunity. But the problem is that the starting point is not the same for those 3 people. One is much taller and the other one is a little less tall and the other one is much smaller. So what you want to do is give people who are disadvantaged a head start. This is what is called equality of opportunity, not equal opportunity, but equality of opportunity, so that you are giving people with a disadvantage a bit more help, extra help, so that they are then on the same field, isn't it? So open access is deeply grounded. This idea of open access is got a philosophical bend. Access has to do with that. This is the idea that I was talking about. Access has to do with giving people equality of opportunity, so that the guy from the village or from the disadvantaged situation needs a bit more help. Because otherwise they will never be able to get there. Women in our society, for example, need a bit more help, because they will never be able to compete with men, because men have been at it for longer and have had more resources. So this is the idea of, people talk about equal opportunity, but equal opportunity in itself does not cut it. That means like you've got to compete on the same playing field. Well, that's not fair, isn't it? You can't put men and women in the same playing field and ask them to do the same sort of things. So this is where equality of opportunity comes. So this is the foundation, this is the principle behind the idea of open access. Now, open learning, which I was talking about, the second, is the idea that we're all very familiar of, that you have, you're able to study at any time, any pace, at your place, and this sort of thing. Now, open scholarship is this idea that I was talking about sharing your educational resources openly and freely. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the underlying assumptions. So what are the ethical, remember I talked about the ethical assumptions of this. So those are three concepts. The three concepts are open access, open learning, and open scholarship. Those are the founding principles of open education. So when we are talking about open education, we are talking about those three fundamental things. So what are the underlying assumptions? There, as I was saying, one of the fundamental principles that governs this kind of a strategy is that education is a public good. There are ethical and moral implications of open education. A duty of care for the students, And the educational organization assumes a responsibility. This is why organizations like USP, when it started 50 years ago, almost mandated that, it can't be just a face-to-face campus-based organization. It had to have a flexible learning, a distance education operation, because it saw that the educational organization has a responsibility for providing the best, or at least a high-quality educational experience to those who need it or join it. And oftentimes such organizations, we articulate that in our mission and goals. We say this, that this university is open to places and those kinds of things, so that we make sure that it's stated in our mission and educational goals and strategic plans that our objective is to make education available to more than the people who are able to come just to the campus. And you would think, now you follow me carefully and you'll see where I'm going with this. And when students and parents send their children to USP, they will say, oh, USP is a particular type of organization, that's why we are sending our children there. So, for example, right now, we are doing that. In the midst of this COVID crisis, we're saying that, from semester 2, we are going totally online. There's call centers, people can call in, materials are online, lectures will be online. So we are making promises, in a sense. So we make that promise, and the parents and the students will make decisions based on the premise, on the promises that we make. Because they will say, all right, if USP is promising X, Y, and Z, and FNU, which is another university in this country, promises something else. Parents and students will make a decision on which institution they should go to. And when they come to this university, they have a right to expect those kinds of things. All right? So you see, as an employer or as an organization, we have made promises. This is not very different from going to the supermarket or going to a shop. The shop says, come to my place, or the movie cinema can come to my place, we'll give you X number of experience. So you pay the money on the basis of that and you go in. Now, if you don't get that experience, then there's a problem, right? Okay, see, this is an ethical issue. So this is why, hold that thought, and I will come to that. Now, here's the problem. Organizations will promise a lot of things, but they will fail to deliver. All right? Universities will say, we are doing X, Y, and Z, and we will offer you X, Y, and Z, but they fail to deliver. A problem arises when a party fails to keep their promise. For instance, if a student, let's say, for example, who came to the university and copied stuff without acknowledging it, or got somebody else to sit their exam, the universities will very quickly reprimand them, right? Okay? They'll tell them, you're expelled or given a second chance or whatever. But when an educational institution fails to deliver on its promises, then what happens? Who holds the educational institution up for what they were supposed to deliver? Remember I said, if I go back a slide, the responsibility of the organization is articulated in a variety of ways, including organizational missions and goals and strategic plans. So the universities and the faculties will very, very quickly say that we'll promise you this, we'll give you that, we will support you with this. But when it doesn't happen, what if the lecturer doesn't show up in class? Or what if the lecturer doesn't show up online as they promised that they would? When they do not provide high quality teaching and support to the student, then what happens? You see, oftentimes those kinds of implications are not clearly articulated. What happens? When a student fails to deliver on their promises, we are very clear about that. But when an institution fails to deliver on the promises, we're not very clear about that. So what does failing to deliver on promises mean? For example, the levels of recruitment and retention of popular or high-quality staff are never clearly linked to the promises the organization will have made to its students. So you might say, if the university says, for example, if the organization says that we will deliver high-quality teaching and learning, who is responsible for making sure that the staff who are recruited are capable of providing you that high quality teaching and learning, all right? Now, here's a subtle point. Most of the university staff who are appointed to their positions are not qualified in teaching and learning. And yet you made a promise to give you high quality teaching and learning, and yet you don't have staff. So you see how that loop needs to be closed, so that if you promised students a high quality of teaching and learning, a flexible approach to teaching and learning, at your own time, at your own place, an online presence. No. So have you got staff on board who are capable of doing that? And if you don't, then you failed on your promises. One could argue. But who is to hold you account on that? Where is the process for holding you to account on that? Here's another point. More often than not, and especially in higher education, the curriculum and its pedagogy. There's a difference between curriculum and pedagogy. Curriculum is what is being taught. Pedagogy is how it's being taught. Is often determined and influenced by the individual faculty, members, or a few people. Very arbitrary processes. Okay, you might argue that, the content of a curriculum is often determined in academic committees, but still determined by a few people. How it's determined, who is supposed to moderate that is not always very clear, although one could argue that we have come a long way. So I'm not going to belabor that point, because there are accrediting agencies, so the professional accounting bodies will make sure that what's taught, say in the accounting degree, is what they would want their graduates to possess. But oftentimes in this, students don't really have a voice as to what is taught and how it is taught. Now, it's debatable. I'm just raising that point. How much voice should students have, and what are the mechanisms for that? Because organizations will argue that the curriculum and its pedagogy is the domain of experts. What would the students know about it? That's why they're here to study. So that what goes into a course and how it's taught is the academic's responsibility. And organizations have ways of seeking feedback from students. But when that process fails, it is arguable that below par educational practices amount to a failure on the part of the educational organization to meet the commitments that they promised. And one could argue a neglect of duty of care. You could argue that. If you are not delivering to the student, or you're not, I hate the word delivery, if you're not making accessible to the students openly, freely, accessible learning opportunities, and you promised them that in the first place, then there's a dereliction of duty of care, isn't it? One could argue that. You know, I'm not saying I'm arguing that, but remember, I'm talking about ethics of educational practices. So let's just go a little further on that one. The key point made in favor, for example, open educational resources is a big thing, right? People are talking. Let me just define that very quickly. Open educational resources are resources that are differently licensed, right? So the key point people who are making in favor of the adoption of OER is the ability to mitigate the rising costs of commercially published textbooks. So David Wiley and a few people in the United States who started talking about open educational resources because they said that open educational resources mitigate the high cost of textbooks. Now, this goes back to the idea of open scholarship. You know, the books that were written by academics when they were employed are now being sold by publishers by exorbitant amounts of price. And all of you would have bought a textbook. Tell me a textbook that is no less than $100. You know, it'll be hard to find, right? So in many cases, if you've got to buy 6 or 7 textbooks or 4 or 5 textbooks, that can be quite a cost, right? So the open educational resources movement came out and said, we can provide students with the similar quality educational resources that are not that costly. This is why we talk about open educational resources. But here's the point. Yet providing educational resources cheaply to students is rarely proposed as an institutional imperative. And how are open educational resources going to make a student's learning experience any better apart from reducing the cost? So apart from costs, it is not made clear how open educational resources are really going to improve the quality of the learning experience. And then there are other issues with the adoption of open educational resources. Besides, if the reduction of, now here, listen to this point. If the reduction of the costs of education for students were the end game, if reducing the costs of education is the end game, then surely there are many more expedient ways of achieving this. One could argue that, you know, there are services on campus or off campus that cost money that should be cut. In the instance of saving educational resources and not taking that out of the equation. Yet teachers and students are expected to be hunting for and adopting open educational resources which are valid and reliable with any clear help. So institutions will say, all right, we should be adopting open educational resources, but we leave this responsibility onto the teachers who are not qualified, are not aware of what are open educational resources, number one, where to find them, number two, which is why we are doing what we are doing at organizations like this, to make sure that our teachers are qualified and prepared to do the kinds of things that we expect them to do and promise that they will do. And then again, open educational resources is something that is accessible and available on the internet, all right? Without connectivity, you can't have access to open educational resources. So is it fair to expect students and teachers to have open educational resources without access to the internet? If they don't have access to the internet, then what? And also, we in this English-speaking world, and I know this is meant for a Portuguese-speaking world, so there are educational resources in the Portuguese language, but most of us, when we talk about open educational resources, we're talking about open educational resources in the English language. Now, if you don't speak English, then what? You know, where are the open educational resources that are in other languages? So we haven't really broken the barriers there. Now, the protagonists of open educational resources and educational institutions are quite happy to pass this role on to novice teachers and students, to say, you go and find open educational resources. It's a good thing to do. But without actually giving them the training that they need in order to integrate open educational resources in their teaching and learning. But you see, I have been criticizing myself a little bit because I'm a proponent of open educational resources. But you see, none of that may be such a bad thing, because there is much learning going on when students and teachers are being encouraged and expected to search for and evaluate educational resources, because we do this all the time when we are searching for educational resources. We go to the library, we search for things, we see a lot of things, and some we discard and some we accept, you know. See, open educational resources, same thing. The contentious issue has to do with the ethics of these expectations. Now, here's the nub. Let me go a bit slowly. Placing students and teachers into an uncharted and unsupported learning and teaching environment amounts to a serious dereliction of responsibility by the institution in relation to the quality of educational provision. As such, a neglect of duty of care. So that is a very serious accusation I am making. I'm not accusing anybody, but I'm making a point that, you see, professional development of teachers in online learning, if we promise that we're offering online learning, technology-enhanced learning, if we are promising technology-enhanced learning, is essential. Because if we don't do that, then you are failing on your promises. Then you've taken the money, they paid the money, the parents came to you because you said you're going to offer it, but now you're not offering it because your teachers are not equally professionally qualified. This is why we have what we have. And so in many ways I am arguing in favor of an enhancement of the role of Center for Flexible Learning, for example, because that's what the Center for Flexible Learning does. It provides that kind of help to the teachers and to the students to survive an environment like this, especially with the COVID crisis, when everything is going online. Suddenly you throw everybody at the deep end. Well, if you're not going to teach them how to swim, they're not going to learn how to swim right there and then. You've got to provide some props, right? And if you don't, they are going to sink. So this is a very important point. Open content, no more content, is not going to be good enough. Support has to be provided. What will make for good teaching is the design of relevant, suitable, and authentic learning experiences. And that's what centers like us do. We help people design learning experiences, integrate open educational resources, and give students the productive learning experiences that we promised that they would get. But we don't have this kind of conversation. I mean, I would put you on the spot to say, how many times have you heard these kinds of conversations taking place at universities or institutions of higher education? Because if we're not talking about our responsibilities and expectations in alignment with our promises that we make and how we organize our resources and our staffing to support those kinds of, then we are sort of, flapping our wings in the air kind of thing and not going anywhere, isn't it? I mean, that's the point that I'm making. So let me talk, I've got a couple more points and then I'm done. And the first one has got to do with open educational resources. The second one, as a matter of fact. And I did say quite a bit about open educational resources. The case for open educational resource, the socio-political imperatives of OER are justifiable. So we say, all right, because we want to make educational resources available to a lot of people, as many people as possible is justifiable. Okay, and without that, one could argue that you can't really achieve the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals or Millennium Development Goals. What's the point of talking about these goals when people don't have educational resources? This goes back to the point that I made earlier, was this idea of equitable access. If people don't have access to educational resources, then They're not even at the starting point, isn't it? So what is the point of United Nations talking about education for all, or every child having the opportunity, if they don't have access to the resources? So access is very important. But the educational and economic argument for their widespread adoption are still not entirely clear and convincing for many. Some people would argue against that. Some people would suggest that despite growing interest from stakeholders in opening up access to scholarly literature, student uptake of OER is not determined by the cost of the purchase. So not everybody is struggling for money. People don't, like in some parts of the world you might say, all right, I'm not going to buy the textbook because it costs a lot of money. But there are many other places people don't care. People buy the textbook, whatever it costs. So cost is not always a factor, and this is the people will say about the cost. But the educational argument, listen to the educational argument. The educational argument suggests that content should be released with permissions so users are able to revise, remix, and use it. But the thing that you might want to think about is, how necessary is it to revise and remix? I mean, this revision and remixing thing is another contentious issue. That, people might argue that every time you pick up a textbook, you would want to revise and remix it. Is it always true? Some people might argue. Well, no, it's not always true that every time you pick up a textbook, an article, you want to revise it. You might take parts of it, you might not take parts of it, but you're not necessarily always revising and remixing. Teachers don't always, and learners don't always rip apart, an educational resource. Besides, it might not be advisable. What I have written in a chapter or in a book is my view. See, if you disagree with it, fine, you do your own. But you don't always rip apart everything that I write. So, see, the educational argument of open educational resources is also a bit contentious. Open educational resources in itself would not improve educational practice. Content is often selected for their overall suitability and relevance. The adoption of OER will improve access, but it will not necessarily improve educational practice. Here is the nub of the issue. Any educational resource, any content in a book or a chapter or a journal article, it needs to be carefully integrated into the learning and teaching transaction. Otherwise, it's a piece of content sitting outside the learning experience. So the role of content is very important. Now, let me illustrate that by this diagram. If you think about it, this is how a learning experience might begin. Let me just go through it quickly. Now, in designing that experience that I was talking about, you begin with your commitments, right? Every organization will make some commitments to your learners. What are my commitments to my learners at a sort of macro level as well as at a micro level? Then those commitments that are big, broad goals will drop down to learning outcomes. And from learning outcomes, you develop some sort of a context, a problem situation or a scenario. Then you select content that will be used by the learners to work within that scenario. Let's say it's some kind of a situation where people have to carry out a project. So you design the project, you design a problem, you organize students into groups, and then you give them content. So the educational resources belong to that content bit, and they come in books or technology forms and other forms. So this is the kind of thing that we do in a center for learning and teaching like ours, a Center for Flexible Learning. We design the learning experiences for our students. It is important to design the experience in order to integrate the educational resources. What tends to happen is we focus too much on the content. We try and teach people what's in the content, what's in the book. And that is often easily forgotten. Books change as well. Knowledge gets updated. And this is the big problem, that in universities and higher education institutions, oftentimes we spend our time teaching people what is in the content, what is in the book, what is in the chapter. We don't spend enough time designing the experience, because when you think about it, the experience is the thing that the students will keep. They will say, oh, I was involved in this project at the university, it was fascinating, I learned X, Y, and Z, I used that book. But later on, you know what they will remember? They'll remember the experience. They won't remember what was in the book, and they might not need to remember what is in the book, because the book would have changed. The content would have changed, and it will change. Okay, it might not change in basic chemistry. Basic chemistry doesn't change. But take any other subject, philosophy, education, history, politics, engineering. Content changes because new knowledge is coming out. We're learning new things. You know, the book that I used when I was an undergraduate student, I don't know where they are. I don't ever use those books anymore. They're different books I look at. But what I remember from those days is the experience that I was part of. And this is the big dichotomy, focusing on content versus the context. A lot of people say content is king. Well, I have an alternative view that content is not king. Context is king or queen, if you like it. You know, and that's what we do. And this goes back to the point that I was talking about, how we teachers, we need to upskill, empower our teachers to focus on the design of the learning experiences. Well, this is what we do. We call ourselves learning designers. We call ourselves learning experience designers. We call ourselves instructional designers. What kind of designing do you do? What is your core competency? Now that's another conversation. So what is important is how an educational resource or parts of it, open or not, are used and integrated into an experience. Unless we make this the starting point of our narrative and demonstrate its benefit to learning and teaching, our efforts will remain subject to skepticism. You know, I chuckle at it because, you know, MOOCs, many of you will know, refers to massive open online courses. Is this idea of online courses that have got large enrollments, and then the basic premise of MOOCs was that when you put very large numbers of students in an online environment, learning will take place almost automatically, right? But you will know that just a minute ago, I was banging on and on about how important designing the learning experience is, how important it is to integrate educational resources. So now MOOCs come along and say, no, you don't have to do all of that. Just put a bunch of students in an online classroom, and they will learn by themselves. And there are people who strongly believe in that, you know, if you put just a whole lot of people into a classroom and give them connectivity, they will learn by themselves. And I can name you some prominent researchers who argue that way. But the question is, what kinds of learners we're talking about? So just to go back and make sure that there is continuity in my thought here, and here I was talking about the importance of designing the learning experiences and integrating the open educational resources so that we don't throw our students into an ocean and expect them to survive, right? Similarly, we provide help to our teachers, because if we don't provide the help to our teachers could argue that you promised the world everything, but you're not upskilling us, equipping us in order for us to be able to do the job that you expect us to do. So there's an argument to be made there. Then the MOOCs completely threw everything off the window, because they say that, you know, people will learn by themselves, and knowledge building, the idea of development of knowledge is a social process. Sure, some of that is correct. I mean, we can learn by ourselves, but we learn most effectively when we are put in a group situation, we interact with other people, we interact with resources, we learn in a social setting. So learning is both an individual process as well as a social process, one could argue. right? And MOOCs were based on this idea that, you know, people will construct knowledge if you put them together, and I'm not surprised that that's going to happen. And you can use large numbers of students, anytime, any place, and the idea is participation, you know, participatory pedagogy, that people will learn by connection, collaboration, cooperation, and co-creation. Nobody would argue with that. Those are good things. But here's the problem with MOOCs. Then all those good intentions that George Siemens and his colleagues were talking about in 2012 went out the window when institutions started to think that MOOCs is a way of making money. We can get many more students around here, and they will eventually become, some of them will register full-time. So organizations, you know, Ivy League institutions like MIT, Stanford University, you know, you would think, my God, these guys were never in the business of online education, and now they are the biggest providers of MOOCs. But one could argue that their intention was not this idea that putting groups of people together and they will learn, but was to attract more people to the institutions. So the idea of profiteering and most of these practices were very poor. So many of the MOOCs were very poorly designed, because that was the idea of, so one would have thought, how did MOOCs get to be the way they are? Who said that a MOOC needs to have videos, number one, and what? There had to be a large number of students. You know, Siemens and Down never said that, you know, MOOCs were supposed to have videos. So where did that idea come from? It was certainly not an educational input. So you would think that a lot of people who come into the educational arena come with a variety of intentions. I mean, another example that comes to my mind is this idea of remote learning, right? Now, you and I have been in the business of distance education and correspondence education for a long time. So somebody just plonked an idea called remote education in the event of COVID crisis. So you would, the first question you would ask, why was there a need for a new idea? Is it not distance education that we are talking about? So who brought this new idea called remote? And is remote education any different from distance education? Is it really? You know, and how is it different? So you see, people, I mean, you can't stop people from throwing words around. They do throw words around, right? Willy-nilly. Now, I would have thought, why are we talking about remote learning? We are talking about online education, everything that we were talking about, right? But of course, we have not got everything online as much as we would like it because of the way we had to react to the situation quickly. But we are in the business of distance education. We are in the business of online education, right? And it's not a dichotomous scale, it's a continuum, right? So we are sitting at some point on that scale. We are going to get better. So why introduce a term called remote education? But see, this is the people who don't understand what we are talking about, and they suddenly come up with terms. It's a term that some American university, which had no trajectory in distance education, comes up with this idea that we were face-to-face and now we are remote. Okay. Now, what does that really mean? Nobody explained that. But because it came from a powerful American university, it becomes a catchphrase. Everybody starts talking about it. It makes no sense to me when we are really talking about online education. So MOOCs were the same sort of thing. It became an instrument of profiteering, attracting large numbers of students. So if MIT says, you know, 30,000 students registered in their fundamentals in engineering course, even if 3,000 of them turned into registrations, they would have still won. But they don't care that, you know, 27,000 students dropped out. And how do you assure quality in MOOCs? So the problem with MOOCs also has been that everything that we have known about online education and how people learn, about the power of discussion, the power of conversation, the power of collaboration, the power of group work, nothing's new about this, right? We know about these sorts of things, but none of this got injected into MOOCs. MOOCs were this lean, mean idea, do a video, plunk it up, away you go. Listen to the video, answer some quizzes, you're done. Who said MOOCs were supposed to be like that? Everything that we know about education, we just ignored it. Just ignored it. Didn't want to listen. Even good videos. I've seen MOOCs where you have a Nobel prize-winning professor using a chalkboard with a back to the camera. And you think people who know anything about video would say that's not a good video. And you record it, you put it online as part of your MOOC, and you think you've done a MOOC. That makes me angry. This is neglect of responsibility. This is what I'm talking about. We haven't thought through these things. We have ignored what we know. It's not because we don't know what a good online learning experience needs to be. We know all of this. It's there. It's in the literature. It's been there for a long time. And there are people in places around the world who know this. But we ignore all that. And we just plow through with new terminologies and new practices. The long history of learning and teaching in open, flexible, distance, and online mode, using a mixture of media and open distance, was even considered as part of that equation. Assessment. I mean, the best forms of assessment we have seen so far, quizzes. Okay, you can have good quizzes, but apart from that, we haven't really thought about assessment. You talk to people about how you can assess learning online, and they suddenly start talking about how can we put videos, how can we put cameras and computers, but we don't think about, okay, haven't you thought about how an assessment could be changed in a slightly different way so that you could assess learning outcomes using the capability of the technology and designed in such a way that people can't cheat that easily? There are strategies, but nobody talks about them, and you wonder why. That's why the question that I'm asking, are contemporary MOOCs defensible? One could argue, or maybe, I'm thinking of a situation, for example, you have a MOOC, good or bad or poor or strong. But there's a guy in Africa who has connectivity, there's a guy in India who has connectivity, and they can listen to a Nobel Prize winning professor. Now, good or bad, that video is still worth it, isn't it? Otherwise, this guy will never have access to that opportunity. So while I argue that MOOCs can be better, but I also support the view that if it is worth doing, then it's worth doing poorly. That the guy out there in the remote village, and the only thing that they would need is connectivity, and connectivity is improving. If you go to the developed world, you'll find that everybody has a mobile phone. So if I'm driving a rickshaw somewhere in India, and I can access a video from Yale University or MIT, I'm winning. I'm winning, haven't I? But it's not good enough for the guy in the US or in Australia or in the UK. But it's good for the guy who has got nothing. So I'm not begging MOOCs. What I'm saying is we can do better, but what we're doing is still defensible. And remember, MOOC is, we talk about MOOCs because we started talking about the power of online education. But nobody talks about MOOCs that are accessible in print form. Why not? I mean, we used to send out print material at USB for thousands of students, just printed materials. There were MOOCs, one form or the other. Well, they were not online, right? So they can't be MOOCs. So one begins to argue, what is the real agenda of MOOCs, Many would argue that it's an idea of a shop front, like as I was saying, a shopkeeper opens up some things and gives a few things free, and then expect you walk into the shop and then you'll probably buy a few more things, or you stay or you come back. And one could argue that it's a new pathway, that some people will come and take a MOOC and then they will take another course and then become students. So it's another pathway. So it doesn't matter how many students drop in or drop out. So as a journal editor, I get a lot of articles about students dropping out of MOOCs, and I'm saying, well, why bother? Because the students never intended to be there anyway. You go into MOOCs because you want to check out a few things, right? You want to listen to an interesting video from a very reputable professor who you would never be able to access under most circumstances unless you had the money and the resources to pack your bags and go to Yale or MIT, for example. And it's also an idea to promote bench. So I'm actually supporting MOOCs. MOOCs have a purpose. But all I was saying was that I think we can do better. Because we have this idea of the duty of care for a student, putting students into an environment where we're expected to bear the costs of learning and to survive by themselves seems somewhat unfair. Having said all of that, and I'm almost coming to the end of my presentation, the idea of open education, friends, is not new. And I speak in favor of open education, although in this presentation I've been a critic of open education. But I've criticized the idea of open education mostly from the things that we are promising and not doing. So I'm not against open education. I'm the greatest proponent of open education. But if you are in the business of open education, then you've got to do other things. You've got to follow it up. What my problem is that there is very little socialization of this idea among senior management in universities throughout the world. And a failure to rethink and recalibrate our learning and teaching choreographies, how we support teachers, and how we support faculties, to engage in what we are promising, if we are promising online education to our student, is a major weakness. And this is the most important challenge, most potent challenge that faces enterprise adoption of open educational practices. In most cases, we promise open educational practices, but it sits on the periphery, it sits on the side, it sits something as a fun thing to do, but it's not integrated into our core businesses. And that's where the problem lies with organizations throughout the world, not just in this part of the world or in other parts of the world that I was talking about. Most of these organizations who are practicing the kinds of things that I was talking about, MOOCs, open educational resources, open scholarship, open pedagogy sometimes they talk about, are willing to experiment with this idea on the side, but they're not willing to change their core business. Because it's hard. Because it's hard. And that socialization is lacking. Education is a public good, and it's the greatest leveler because education will make everybody equal. Education will enable you to get the freedom, the money that you need. And then to achieve the kinds of goals that we are talking about in terms of the Millennium Development Goals and Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. But without a reconsideration, without a rethink of our institutional choreographies, the way we are organized, the way we conduct ourselves, the way we conduct our businesses, we are not going to be able to achieve the kinds of goals that we promise ourselves and promise our students and promise our parents and promise our teachers. With those thoughts, I'm going to leave it, and thank you very much for your attention.